This is my true story. 23 years ago, I found 7 small boys drifting on the deck of a wrecked ferry during a storm that nearly took my life too. No names, no parents, no voices left, just fear and the sound of rain. I brought them onto my small fishing boat, fed them, named them, and raised them like they were my own blood. For 2 decades, they were my world, my reason to wake up each morning. But one day, 7 strangers appeared on a dock with photographs and tears, and everything I knew collapsed. Before I continue, tell me, if the children you called your own were suddenly claimed by others, would you fight to keep them or let them go? Please subscribe so you don't miss the choice I made. The night I found them was the kind of night that tests a man's soul. The sea wasn't calm that evening. It was alive, angry, tearing through everything that dared float on its surface. I had been out longer than I should have, chasing the last of the nets before the storm made it impossible to return home. Lightning split the horizon into shards, and the rain came down so hard it blurred the line between sky and water. I was ready to turn back when I saw the wreck. A half-sunken ferry, tilted like a wounded beast, its lights flickering weakly through the dark waves. At first, I thought no one could have survived. The ocean was swallowing it whole, pulling wood and metal into its mouth. But then I heard it. Faint, broken cries carried by the wind. I steered closer, hands shaking, eyes burning from salt and fear. When I reached the deck, I saw them. 7 small boys, huddled together near the railing, soaked to the bone. Their clothes were torn, their faces streaked with tears and seawater. They didn't speak. They just clung to each other like a single body, shivering and waiting to disappear. There were no adults, no other survivors. The ferry's name was half gone from the hull, eaten by rust and storm. I didn't stop to think. I tossed a rope and shouted through the thunder, but none of them moved until I climbed aboard myself. The deck groaned beneath my boots. The waves slammed against the sides, shaking everything loose. I grabbed the nearest boy, couldn't have been older than 4, and carried him to my vessel. One by one, I went back for the rest. By the time I lifted the last child, my strength was gone. The ferry vanished behind me seconds later, swallowed by the sea. When I finally made it back to my boat, I collapsed beside them. They were silent, their lips blue, their tiny hands gripping the wet floor. I wrapped them in blankets, lit the small oil lamp, and whispered words they couldn't understand. Not because of language, but because they were too broken to hear anything. I tried to find out who they were, where they came from, but there were no clues. No identification, no papers, no names sewn into their clothes. Just 7 lost souls delivered to me by the storm. I radioed the coast that night, but no one answered. The storm had knocked out the signals, and no rescue boats could leave the harbor. It was just me, the ocean, and those 7 boys. I stayed awake till dawn, making sure they were breathing. One had a fever, another had a cut on his leg, but all of them lived. Somehow, against everything, they lived. When morning came, the sea had calmed. The wreck was gone, nothing left but floating debris and silence. I looked at them, still sleeping in a pile of blankets, their faces soft again under the weak light. I knew then that whatever their past had been, it had been erased by that night. The ocean had taken everything from them, and in a way, given them to me. I decided to give them names, one by one. Simple names, names the sea could carry without forgetting. Each name felt like a promise, that they would live, that they would be safe. I cooked what little food I had, shared it between them, and watched them eat in silence. When I finally looked out over the water again, the waves had turned gentle. The same sea that had taken so much had left me 7 reasons to keep living. I didn't know why I had been chosen to find them, but I knew I couldn't return them to nothing. That night when the wind grew quiet, I made a vow. I would be their father, and this boat would be their home. The years that followed turned the wreckage of that night into the beginning of a life I never expected. My small fishing vessel, once a lonely man's home, became a cradle for 7 growing boys. The sea became our roof, our road, our everything. I patched the cracks in the hull with my own hands, added bunks from driftwood and rope, and turned the deck into a playground where laughter replaced thunder. The ocean that had once howled with loss now sang with their voices. They learned fast, faster than I could have dreamed. The oldest helped me set the nets, pulling with all his strength, even when his hands blistered. The youngest learned to steer the rudder, his tiny fingers gripping the wheel with a seriousness that made me smile. I taught them everything I knew: how to read the clouds for storms, how to mend a torn sail, how to tell direction by the stars when the compass failed. The lessons that had once kept me alive now became the stories that built our family. We didn't have land, but we had each other. The boat rocked us to sleep every night, the sea whispering like a lullaby against the hull. The boys grew sunburned and strong, their hair lightened by salt and wind. I taught them to write their names in chalk on the deck, and when the tide washed it away, they'd write them again. Proof that they existed, that they were more than what the storm tried to erase. Money was always short, but hunger never won. We fished, traded, repaired nets for other sailors at nearby docks. Sometimes, when we anchored near a town, I took the boys to the market. They'd run through the stalls, wide-eyed at the colors, the smell of fruit, the sound of voices not shaped by the sea. I'd watch them from a distance, proud and terrified at the same time. Proud of the men they were becoming, terrified that one day they might want a life that didn't include me. People in port towns came to know us by sight. They called us the boat family. Some thought we were strange, others kind. I didn't care what they said. My sons were happy. Their laughter filled the space where loneliness used to live. And every time someone asked if they were mine, I nodded. Because they were. Maybe not by blood, but by bond. When storms hit, we faced them together. When food ran short, we shared what we had. They fixed the engine when it broke, held me steady when my back ached too much to haul the nets. As the years passed, I stopped thinking of the night I found them. That memory drifted farther away, replaced by new ones. Birthdays we celebrated on deck, songs sung under the moon, mornings where they woke before dawn to surprise me with coffee and laughter. I never asked where they truly came from. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Maybe I just believed that love could be enough to rewrite history. I saw no reason to search for ghosts when the living sat beside me every day. The sea had taken them from one world and given them to mine, and I accepted that as destiny. They began calling me Papa, first shyly, then with pride. Each time I heard it, something inside me healed a little more. The cracks left by my own solitude closed. I had no wife, no land, no inheritance to give, but what I gave was life, the kind built from sweat, salt, and second chances. The boat grew older with us. Its boards creaked like old bones, the paint faded, but it never failed us. Every plank held memories, tiny hands gripping the rails, laughter echoing across the waves, the smell of fish mixed with the sweetness of fresh bread baked in our little stove. We weren't rich, but we were whole. Years passed like tides, coming, going, carrying us forward. The boys became men, and I, an old fisherman, believed the sea had forgiven me for all my mistakes. But the ocean doesn't forgive or forget. It only waits. 23 years slipped by like waves rolling over the same shore. Seasons blurred into each other, some rough, some kind. But the rhythm of our life never changed. Dawn was for fishing, dusk was for stories. The sea had become our village, our home, our inheritance. I watched the boys grow taller than me, their shoulders strong, their eyes bright with the kind of courage only water can teach. One by one, they became men, but no matter how old they grew, I could still see the frightened faces I'd pulled from the wreck that night. We moved from coast to coast, never staying long in one place. The world changed around us. New boats, new towns, new flags on the docks. But we remained the same. Our boat aged with grace, its wood worn smooth by time and hands. Every repair, every nail, every patch was a memory stitched into the body of our home. I taught the boys how to read the wind, how to bargain with traders, how to repair an engine using little more than patience and wire. They learned to cook their catch, to fix sails, to mend nets. What started as survival became a craft, and that craft became pride. They began sending money ahead to local schools whenever we docked for more than a week. "For the little ones who have less," one of them said once. They never forgot what it meant to be lost. My heart swelled with every act of kindness, every gesture that proved the men they'd become. I saw my reflection in them, not in the shape of their faces, but in the way they cared for others. In time, we became a legend among sailors. People recognized the boat family. Some whispered stories about how I'd found them. Some true, most not. A few said I'd stolen them. Others said the sea had chosen me. I never corrected anyone. The truth was simple. I had saved them, but they had saved me more. Our lives were built around tides and storms. Birthdays were marked by the moon, celebrations by calm weather. We had no walls, no address, no fence, but we had something purer. The freedom to belong nowhere and still feel at home. When the storms came, they worked beside me as equals. When the nets broke, they mended faster than I ever could. When I grew older and my hands began to tremble, they took the wheel. I stopped being their rescuer and became their shadow, guiding, watching, proud. But even as joy filled our days, time carved its quiet warnings into my bones. I could feel age creeping up, like rust beneath paint. My knees hurt when I climbed the deck stairs. My hearing faded with the roar of the waves. I didn't say anything. I didn't want them to worry. I told myself I'd raised them strong enough to stand without me, that one day they'd each find their own harbor. Still, the thought of them leaving tightened my chest like a storm I couldn't outrun. The youngest, once a boy afraid of thunder, grew into a navigator, sharp-eyed, steady-handed. The oldest became the heart of the family, the one the others listened to when I couldn't speak. They took turns maintaining the engine, checking the nets, guiding the others. They were no longer 7 lost children. They were brothers, bound by a story only the sea and I truly remembered. We'd built a life from nothing, and for more than 2 decades, it felt unbreakable. I believed the past was buried deep beneath the waves, forgotten and forgiven. But the sea doesn't bury secrets. It hides them. And sometimes, when the water is calm enough, it reflects what you don't want to see. On the 23rd year, in a small harbor I'd never planned to visit, that reflection came back to me, not through waves, but through faces I didn't recognize. Faces holding old photographs, hands trembling with something I hadn't seen in years. Hope. The past had found us again. It happened on a morning that should have been ordinary. The sea was calm, the sky pale and gentle after a night of soft rain. The boys, now men, were unloading the nets, their laughter carrying across the water like a song I had grown used to hearing. I stood on deck, sipping coffee, watching the sunlight catch on their shoulders. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked. I had no idea that peace was already ending. We had docked at a small harbor along the southern coast, just another stop for repairs and supplies. The smell of salt and diesel filled the air, and the port workers moved like shadows between crates and ropes. Nothing about the morning stood out, until I noticed the man standing still at the far end of the dock. He wasn't working. He wasn't waiting for a ship. He was staring. At first, I thought he was just curious. People often watched us. A family that lived entirely on a boat was unusual, even strange to some. But this man's eyes weren't filled with curiosity. They were filled with recognition. His hand trembled as he reached into his coat pocket, and when he pulled out a folded photograph, I felt the air tighten around me. He stepped closer, slow and cautious, as though afraid of what he might find. I saw him look at my oldest son, the one I had named Elias, and his face went pale. The man whispered something, a name I didn't recognize, though the sound of it hit my chest like a wave. Elias didn't hear him at first, but when he turned, their eyes met. And in that small, impossible second, something shifted. The laughter on the deck faded. The air went still. I watched the stranger's lips move, his voice barely audible over the sound of water hitting wood. I couldn't make out the words, but I saw his expression. Disbelief, then joy, then something like grief. My oldest son froze, his hands dropping the rope he'd been coiling. The others looked at me, confused, searching for reassurance I couldn't give. The man held out the photograph. From where I stood, I could see only part of it. A child, maybe 5 or 6, standing beside a woman in a garden. The child's face was faint, the photo faded by time, but there was something familiar in the curve of the smile, in the tilt of the head. I didn't want to admit it, but it looked like Elias. My stomach turned cold. The stranger said something again, louder this time, and though I still couldn't hear the words, I could see Elias's lips part as he took the picture. His shoulders stiffened, his face draining of color. I stepped forward then, my body moving before my mind caught up. I wanted to protect him, to protect all of them, from whatever this was. But the man looked at me with eyes that carried years of searching. He didn't need to speak. I already knew. For 23 years, I had believed the sea had given me sons. But now, standing on that dock, I realized the sea doesn't give. It only borrows. The rest of the day passed like a fog. The man left without another word, but his shadow stayed behind. Elias didn't speak. He sat alone at the edge of the boat, holding the photograph in shaking hands. The others watched him, whispering among themselves, afraid to ask. I stayed silent too, because deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. That night, I lay awake listening to the water lap against the hull. For the first time in years, the sound didn't soothe me. It sounded like knocking, quiet, patient, insistent, as if something buried long ago was asking to be let back in. And by morning, more strangers would come, with more photographs, more proof, more cracks in the life I had built. By the end of that week, the dock no longer felt like a resting place. It felt like a doorway that would not close. The first stranger had opened something I could not shut. Each sunrise brought new faces, new voices, new hands clutching envelopes that smelled of dust, ink, and lost years. The air filled with quiet grief, the kind that doesn't scream, only trembles. It started with 2 women arriving together one morning, clutching faded papers in clear plastic sleeves. Their steps were hesitant, their clothes simple but neat, the kind worn by people who had carried sorrow for too long but never stopped hoping. I watched them from the deck as they approached, my heart beating slower, heavier, like it already knew the shape of the truth. The taller one called out softly, holding up a photograph that fluttered in the wind. Even from where I stood, I could see it was a picture of a child, small, smiling, standing beside a wooden fence. The curve of that smile, the light in those eyes, it looked like one of mine. The boys, my sons, gathered behind me, silent. They didn't know whether to wave or to run. The women handed me a sealed envelope stamped with a court insignia and trembling handwriting. Inside were documents, birth certificates, missing persons reports, adoption papers that had never been finalized, and letters written in faded blue ink. One of them was addressed to whoever saved our child. I couldn't read more than a few lines before my eyes blurred. Each letter told a story of a family broken by that storm 2 decades ago, families who had been told their children were lost forever when the ferry sank. Each letter carried apologies, memories, and questions. 7 boys missing, 7 families still waiting, 7 lives that the sea had scattered and I had gathered by chance. By the 3rd day, there were more people waiting at the dock than I could count. Some came quietly, standing far away, afraid to believe. Others called out names, not the names I'd given, but the ones written on birth records. Each name felt like a small blade, cutting away at the life we had built. Officials came next, carrying files, badges, and expressions too careful to trust. They spoke to me with politeness, with pity, but their eyes said everything. They already knew. DNA testing, verification, reunification, words that sounded like machinery grinding through the fragile bones of a family. I watched my sons' faces change as the truth unfolded. Confusion turned to shock, and shock turned to quiet anger. Not at me, not yet, but at the cruel unfairness of it all. Their lives had been one story for so long. Now, suddenly, there was another version waiting for them. One written by strangers, one they had no memory of living. Each envelope that arrived carried a new certainty. Photos from childhood, hospital records, family portraits that showed faces just like theirs. The evidence was undeniable. I didn't need a test to know. The sea had not given me sons. It had only kept them safe long enough for the world to find them again. That night, none of us spoke. The deck that was once full of laughter felt like a courtroom. I sat alone near the railing, the letters spread out before me. The ink had begun to smudge from the salt in the air. I traced the handwriting with my fingers, feeling the weight of every word. These weren't accusations. They were gratitude and grief woven together. They thanked me for saving their children, but gratitude couldn't fill the hole opening in my chest. The boys didn't sleep either. I could hear them moving softly in their bunks, whispering, reading the letters again and again. The sound of paper rustling replaced the sound of waves. I wanted to tell them that nothing had changed, that love was stronger than blood, but even as the words formed in my throat, they felt hollow. The sea outside was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that hides a storm beneath it. I had spent 23 years believing I was a father. Now the tide was shifting, and I realized I had only been their keeper. Morning arrived heavy and silent, like the world itself was holding its breath. The air was still, the sea unmoving, and even the gulls circled without sound. My sons, 7 men now, stood on the deck, their faces pale from sleepless nights and too many truths. The dock below was crowded again. Mothers, fathers, officials, strangers with eyes full of years lost to waiting. It felt like Judgment Day had come not from heaven, but from the water. I stood at the bow, my hands gripping the railing, trying to steady the tremor running through me. I had always been strong on this boat. I had been captain, father, teacher, doctor, everything they needed. But that morning, I was just an old man waiting to be emptied. The officials called my name first. Their voices were calm, rehearsed, the way people speak when they want to sound kind but not soft. They carried new papers, ones that declared the truth in official lines and signatures. Guardianship expired. Custody reassigned. Family reunification authorized. Words printed neatly, as if 23 years of love could be filed away under legal order. The boys stood in a line behind me, their eyes darting between the officials and the families waiting on the dock. I could see it in their faces, the pull of two worlds. Behind them was the boat that had raised them. Before them were the people whose blood ran in their veins. I didn't blame them for hesitating. I didn't blame them for hurting. I blamed the sea for playing God. I didn't speak for a long time. I couldn't. My voice felt buried somewhere deep inside my chest, beneath all the years I'd carried for them. But then the oldest, Elias, took a step forward. His jaw was tight, his eyes glistening. He didn't look at me right away. He looked at the horizon first, as if trying to remember which direction home was. Then he turned. The others followed one by one, forming a half circle around me. The officials waited. The families waited. Even the air waited. I searched for words, but all I could manage was breath. I wanted to tell them I had never lied, that I had found them, not stolen them, that I had raised them not because I wanted something, but because I couldn't leave them to die. But how do you explain a love that was never meant to exist? Their faces told me they already knew. They had read the reports, the letters, the documents. They understood everything, even the parts that hurt most. Elias finally spoke, not loudly, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet that breaks more than shouting ever could. I couldn't hear every word, but I felt their weight. They weren't accusations. They were goodbyes. One of the mothers reached out from the dock. Her hands trembled as she called the name of the boy who had once been hers. He turned toward her, unsure, his expression torn between recognition and fear. Another father stepped forward, clutching a faded toy, something he had probably kept for decades, waiting for this impossible day. I stood there, helpless, watching the past reclaim what I had thought was my future. My heart wanted to hold them back, but my hands wouldn't move. Maybe love sometimes means letting the truth undo you. When the officials signaled that it was time, The boys hesitated again. They looked at me, not as children to a father, but as men to the one who had carried them across the years. I nodded once. It was all I could give. The oldest placed his hand briefly on my shoulder. Then he turned away. The dock filled with tears and reunions I couldn't join. The voices blended with the sound of the sea until everything felt distant, like a dream that wasn't mine anymore. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the deck was empty. Only their footprints remained, scattered like the tide that had brought them to me once before. I stood alone, surrounded by silence that had once been laughter. The sea didn't speak. The wind didn't move. It was as if the world itself had paused to watch love lose its shape. The papers came in a brown envelope sealed with ink and authority, a few thin sheets that carried more weight than anything I had ever lifted. The officials placed them gently on the table inside the small harbor office, as if kindness could soften what they meant. I stared at them without touching. My name was printed neatly at the top. Below it, lines of text that spelled the end of something I had spent half my life building. Termination of guardianship, return of custody, acknowledgement of identity restoration. I had read 1,000 tide charts, 1,000 maps, but never anything that made me feel so lost. Outside the window, I could see the 7 of them standing near the dock with their real parents. The reunion had already begun. I couldn't hear what was being said, only the rhythm of it, a mix of sobs and laughter, disbelief and relief. They were surrounded by faces that mirrored theirs, gestures that belonged to another life, voices that sounded both foreign and familiar. Blood was calling them home, and I was the stranger who had kept them from it. The officials spoke softly, explaining what needed to happen. There would be signatures, a transfer, a statement confirming I had never acted with harm or deceit. They said it was all just procedure, but I knew better. Paperwork might make the law neat, but it cannot make love simple. My hands trembled as I picked up the pen. The ink bled slightly into the paper, each letter swallowing years of memory. Every signature felt like tearing out a page of my own story and handing it away. When it was done, the man across from me nodded, gathered the papers, and thanked me for my care and dedication. His words sounded heavy with pity, the kind people use when they don't know how to say goodbye. I nodded back, unable to trust my voice. I walked out into the sunlight. The harbor was alive with sound, gulls, engines, waves, laughter, but all of it seemed distant, like I was underwater. The 7 stood together near the edge of the dock. They looked at me when I approached, and for a long moment, no one moved. The wind carried the scent of salt and diesel, and something else I couldn't name. The scent of endings. They were men now, with beards and scars and stories of their own, yet in that moment they looked like boys again. The same boys I had lifted from the storm all those years ago. My throat tightened as I realized there was nothing left to teach them. They had learned everything already, even how to leave. I stopped a few steps away, not wanting to interrupt what belonged to them. The mothers stood nearby, holding on to their sons like they were afraid the sea would take them again. I couldn't blame them. The sea had taken once and given back nothing easily. One of the officials came forward with the last piece of paper, a formal release. It needed one more signature. I didn't hesitate this time. I signed it, and the man tore off the top copy, handing it to me like a receipt for something irreplaceable. And just like that, it was done. The law had spoken. Love had been measured and filed away. The boys, my sons, didn't rush to leave. They lingered, uncertain, caught between 2 lives. Elias was the first to step forward. He looked at me with eyes that carried everything words could not. He didn't hug me, and I didn't reach for him. We simply stood there, 2 men bound by 23 years, and silence. Then, slowly, he nodded. One by one, the others followed. A glance, a gesture, a quiet goodbye that echoed louder than any storm. When they finally turned and walked toward their families, I felt something inside me give way. Not like breaking, but like release. For years, I had held on too tightly to something that was never meant to stay. Now the sea was taking back what it had only loaned me. As they disappeared into the crowd, I stayed on the dock, the papers still in my hand. The ink was smudged from my sweat, the signatures already fading under the sun. I looked out at the water, calm, endless, patient, and realized that the sea had always known this day would come. I was just the keeper of borrowed suns, and the tide had finally come to collect its debt. The morning they left was brighter than I wanted it to be. The sky was cloudless, the sea smooth like glass, the kind of day meant for beginnings, not endings. But the sea doesn't care what kind of day it gives you. It only moves forward. The sun spilled over the deck, lighting up every corner of the boat that had been our home for 23 years. Every rope, every nail, every scar in the wood seemed to glow with memory. The bunks were stripped, the nets folded, the stove cleaned one last time. It looked less like a home and more like a museum of our life together. The boys stood in a quiet line near the stern, each holding a small wooden box. I had built those boxes myself the night before, carving their initials into the lids with the same knife I'd used for years to gut fish and cut rope. Inside each box, I placed something of their childhood, a piece of rope from their first net, a seashell from the first trip they remembered, a rusted compass that no longer pointed anywhere but home. They didn't open them. They didn't need to. They knew what they held. No one spoke. The silence was thick, the kind that feels heavier than sound. I could hear the water lapping gently against the hull, the slow creak of the ropes, the whisper of the wind through the sails that would never lift again. I stood by the railing, pretending to adjust something on the deck so they wouldn't see my hands shake. I had said everything there was to say in 1,000 unspoken ways over the years, through meals cooked, nets mended, storms weathered together. Words now felt too small to carry what we were losing. Elias was the first to move. He stepped down onto the dock, his boots thudding against the wood with a finality that made my chest tighten. The others followed, one by one, each carrying their box, each pausing for just a second before stepping away from the boat. I memorized their steps, the way the youngest turned slightly to look back, the way the third oldest touched the railing as if saying goodbye to the wood itself. Each movement felt like a nail being driven into something I couldn't repair. The families were waiting at the end of the dock, faces lit with tears and joy, arms open to receive what the sea had once taken. They didn't look at me, and I didn't expect them to. I wasn't part of their story anymore. I was just the man who had held the space between loss and return. When the last of the 7 stepped off, the deck felt suddenly enormous, as if the boat itself exhaled and emptied. I looked around, at the nets that would no longer be hauled, the clotheslines that would no longer hold laughter, the table that would never again be crowded with plates and arguments and stories. Everything around me was still, but the air carried echoes of their voices. I could almost hear them, the splashes, the teasing, the songs they sang when storms frightened them. Memory is cruel that way. It doesn't fade when you want it to. It lingers like salt in the wood. The officials finished their paperwork and left. The dock grew quiet again, the families walking away toward the town, toward new beginnings that had waited 23 years too long. I stayed where I was, staring at the water. The reflection of the boat shimmered beneath me, steady but empty, like an old heart still beating out of habit. I don't know how long I stood there. Time means nothing to the sea, and less to men who've given everything to it. When the sun began to set, the light hit the horizon just right, turning the water gold. For a moment, it almost looked like the night I found them. The same glow, the same promise. Only now, I was alone. I placed my hand on the railing, the wood warm beneath my palm, and whispered without sound, a goodbye not to them, but to the part of me that had been a father. The sea gave me 7 sons and took them back without cruelty, without apology. I could not hate it for that. Some things are not stolen. They are simply borrowed until love has done all it can. The silence that followed was unlike any I had ever known. It wasn't the peaceful kind that comes after a storm, when the sea rests and the world breathes again. It was the kind that swallows everything, the kind that hums in your bones and makes you forget what laughter sounds like. The boat creaked in the night wind, ropes tapping softly against the mast like echoes of footsteps that no longer existed. I had spent 23 years surrounded by noise, voices, arguments, songs, the slap of bare feet on wood, and now every sound seemed too large for the space it filled. At first, I kept expecting them to return. I'd wake before dawn and listen for the thud of boots above deck, the kettle whistling, the quiet hum one of them always made when untangling the nets. I'd find myself cooking for 8 instead of 1, setting out bowls before remembering there was no one left to feed. I caught myself turning to speak, to tell them something about the weather or the tide, only to meet the empty air. The habit of love lingers longer than love itself. Days stretched like tides that refused to turn. I spent them cleaning the same corners, repairing ropes that no longer needed repair, polishing the rails until they gleamed under the sun. I told myself I was keeping the boat ready, just in case they ever came back, but deep down I knew I was only keeping myself from falling apart. The sea, once alive with purpose, had turned quiet too, not in sympathy, but in indifference. The same waves that once carried us together now rolled past, as if nothing had changed. At night, I sat on the deck beneath the stars. For years I had taught them to read the constellations, to find safety in the map of the sky. Now I traced the same patterns alone, whispering their names under my breath like a prayer to no one. The stars didn't answer. They only shimmered, distant and cold, watching as if they knew how small a man becomes when everything he loves leaves him behind. I began hearing things, or maybe remembering them so vividly they became real again. A burst of laughter in the wind, a splash near the hull that sounded like the youngest jumping overboard for a dare, a low hum that carried from nowhere. Once, I woke in the middle of the night, certain that someone had climbed aboard. I ran up to the deck, heart pounding, only to find the moonlight moving through the ropes like ghosts of their shadows. The world moved on without me. The harbor filled with new ships, new crews, new stories. People stopped talking about the boat family. Time erased our legend as easily as a wave erases footprints in the sand. No one asked about the old man who lived alone at sea. I didn't mind. I had already given everything worth remembering to the water. The loneliness became its own rhythm. I started measuring my life by the small things. The tides rise and fall, the shape of clouds, the way light changed the color of the sea from blue to gray to silver. The ocean was the only thing that hadn't left me. It was constant, eternal, uncaring. And for that, I loved it even more. Because it didn't lie. It didn't promise to stay. Sometimes I anchored near towns where we had once docked together. Faces from the past would appear, older now, slower, but still remembering. They'd ask where the boys were, and I'd tell them they'd found their way home. I never said whose home. Some truths aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be carried quietly, like a secret between a man and the sea. Every night before I slept, I walked the deck one last time. I'd look at the 7 empty bunks, the marks on the walls where they had carved their names, the boxes they left behind. The air still smelled faintly of them, salt, sweat, and laughter. I would sit by the railing and listen to the water breathing beneath me. In that silence, I found something close to peace, not the kind that heals, but the kind that accepts. The sea had given me sons and taken them back. My part in their story was over, but the tide never stops. It moves forward, carrying pieces of what was. Small fragments of love that float forever, unseen. I still live on the same boat. It drifts more than it sails now. The engine hasn't run in years, and the sails hang loose like tired lungs. I mend what I can, though the wood has grown soft, the paint pale. The sea doesn't mind. It has always been patient with me, patient with my loneliness, patient with my memories. When the wind rises at night, I imagine it's the voices of my 7 sons, carried across the tide. The boat creaks, the water sighs, and for a moment, I can almost believe they're still here, climbing the ladder, laughing, calling out for supper. The harbor towns have changed, but the sea hasn't. It still keeps its secrets. People who see me now don't know the story. To them, I'm just an old man living out his last years on a forgotten vessel. They don't know that this boat once held a family. They don't know how many nights of storms it survived, how many mornings it carried laughter that could outshine the sun. They don't see the ghosts in the shadows, or the 7 names carved into the railing by small, curious hands. They don't know that every mark, every scar in this wood is a memory. Sometimes, I anchor near the cemetery by the coast. There's a small stretch of land where families who lost loved ones to the sea come to leave flowers. I never go ashore, but I watch from the deck as people kneel and pray, their hands shaking, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere among them are the parents who once took back what was theirs. I don't hate them. I never did. They had lost their children once, just as I am losing mine every day, only slowly, piece by piece, to time. At night, when the stars appear, I speak to the ocean like an old friend. I tell it that I don't hold grudges. I tell it that I understand now. It was never cruelty that made it give me those boys. It was mercy. The sea had saved them from death and given me a reason to keep living. It had loaned me 7 souls to fill the years that would have otherwise been empty. And when it was time, it took them back, not as punishment, but as balance. That's how the sea works. It gives, it takes, and it never apologizes. Sometimes I imagine what they must be doing now. Maybe they visit the sea with their families. Maybe their children hear stories about an old fisherman who raised them on a boat. Maybe somewhere they remember me when they smell salt in the wind or hear gulls in the distance. I don't need them to come back. Love isn't ownership. It's the ability to keep caring even when no one is watching. The boat will not last forever. I can feel it in the way the floorboards groan beneath my feet, in the way the sea seeps through tiny cracks that grow wider each year. When the time comes, I won't fight it. I'll sit on the deck with my back to the setting sun, close my eyes, and listen to the sound of the tide moving closer. Maybe the sea will remember me, the man who loved what it gave him too much to ever let go completely. I used to think loss was an ending. Now I see it's just another form of belonging. Everything the sea takes, it keeps somewhere. In its depths, in its currents, in its endless song. Maybe it keeps love too. And so, I wait. The tide comes in. The tide goes out. The stars move, the world forgets. And I remain here, an old man on a quiet boat, still watching the horizon where past and present meet. Final thought. I raised 7 sons on a boat and thought love alone could make them mine. 23 years later, their real parents returned, and the sea took back what it had lent me. I gave them a life on the water. Blood came back for them, and I was left with the tide.